futuristic home setting from even probably the 1950s. You'll see these sort of home automation ideas. We might consider it also the buzzword that sort of died out around this is smart home, which we might be more familiar with. Sorry about that. The idea is, something you'd see on the Jetsons or, Star Trek. You walk into a room, you speak to some voice, HAL 9000, what have you. Sorry, I'm nerd. I have to throw these nerd concepts out there. You walk into a room and say, tea, Earl Grey hot, and all of a sudden tea is pouring out into a cup for you. That seems like a very futuristic idea when we watched it back then, but now we have the technologies that's caught up to make these sort of things cheap and easy to manufacture and easy to incorporate in an existing technologies. And the idea is to control remotely and to automate. We are a very fast-paced, moving society now. We want everything to happen instantly, everything to happen when we want it to. So the idea of being able to remotely control the devices, control them from your phone, have them centrally managed to run tasks at an exact time, or in the technology realm or in the programming realm, we have the if then else. If this happens, then have this reaction. Sort of like a fire alarm that would automatically call the fire department or tell them where the location is. So that might be a practical small-scale response of an Internet of Things device that can potentially send that sort of a message out. So where are we going to see these? I've been talking a lot about home automation or smart home. So we're controlling all the electronics in your home. And I'm not going to go into too many of them, but if you start looking online for the available electronics, we might typically think of, let's say, a TV, or as I mentioned before, an alarm system, a lock, maybe something like that. But really, almost everything in your home that relies on power, and even some things currently that don't, are going to be incorporated in this Internet of Things, so you can remotely turn them on or off or make sure they're working, functioning properly, all from your smartphone. So they're going to perform these preset tasks, and they can report back to you. As I said, it's not just about automating them, it's also about getting live or almost live feedback. So it's control and also feedback on their status. Is the light bulb on? Is it off? Are my doors locked? I'll probably use that reference a lot. We've seen some of that in recent advertising about this concept. They might have used the phrase Internet of Things, but they are talking sort of about this remote control of your devices. Something else with this isn't just that there's one controller. If you are the person at the light switch, you have control of that light switch. In this, you might be able to grant multiple people in a home. Say it's a household of, the nuclear family, four people. You can grant the parents a higher permission rate than the children, whereas they can control locks and things like that, and the kids can turn lights on and off. So you have not only the physical realm that we're used to interacting with, but you can have this additional layer of either security or control, depending on how you look at it, through multiple user aspects of control. And I think the market right now, from what I've seen, it's really focused more on these home products, individual products. But we can also look at definitely in the future, and maybe they're just not as publicized as much, for sort of corporate level automation. The Internet of Things can also be integrated with existing technology, not only for making a TV part of the Internet of Things, but also in attaching modules or other technology to an existing piece of hardware that might be in a factory or in a building, to make it connected to the Internet of Things through whatever technology that's available, and we'll talk about that in just a little while. So when I say like access to control and monitoring, you have your household level of security controls, and then you'd obviously have a much higher, more detailed, probably much likely more expensive access control for buildings. You have your perimeter control, you have internal controls, you have higher level for maybe a server room or somewhere you keep your intellectual property. But I mentioned heavy machinery there as the idea that, in existing, say, a a car manufacturing plant that has these very expensive machinery in there, the machinery that already exists could have additional equipment attached to it that could bring it online with the Internet of Things, so it could be centrally managed by either the company itself or by a third party without needing to completely replace it. And then we have our device control, and I'm separating that from home automation. This might be something like a pretty popular one is, say, a heart monitor. A lot of us have seen the devices in a local electronics store that say let's stick up to your phone, right? And they, when you're working out, they measure your heart rate. They might measure other things, blood pressure, and, all kinds of sensors out now, how many steps you've taken in the day. So that's not really part of home automation, but that might be a personal device that you keep on you. So a lot of the personal electronics can now be invented for these sort of purposes. There's another trend as wearable electronics. And so those most certainly will communicate through the Internet of Things so that you can interact and control them. As I said, with like the heart rate monitor, you might want to monitor your status. Information updates, again, working out, you want to see how many steps you've taken in a day. So those are more, trivial matters. Obviously, we're focusing heavy on security, but I wanted to give you a good overview of sort of where we currently stand, and in the very near future, more and more devices are going to be incorporated because the technologies that are being used either through wired or wireless exist and have become so cheap that it's trivial to incorporate them in, an existing, I keep mentioning light bulb or lamp or alarm system. Adding the wireless module for it is very cheap, and then it's all about just the development using the existing technology to make it part of, quote unquote, the Internet of Things. So what is the Internet in this Internet of Things? We're used to thinking of the Internet as jokingly a series of tubes, but in all seriousness, this sort of the World Wide Web, right? This is something that's outside of our homes or our offices that connects all the computers through the centralized network. And that's not necessarily what the Internet means here. It might mean your home or local network. If you're in an office, it might be the building itself. If you're home, it's your local access point. It doesn't even necessarily need to rely on the quote-unquote Internet that we're used to labeling. It can go over other wireless protocols that's not Wi-Fi to centrally manage. It can go directly to your smartphone or to your laptop or to your computer. It can be on the Internet but controlled by a cloud-based solution. So the Internet portion is really about the connectivity between the devices and much less so about it actually being, connected to what we often refer to as the Internet. It can be actually completely removed from the Internet. If you're in a highly secured environment, you could still be using, quote-unquote, Internet of Things technologies without being on any sort of local area network. And I think that's going to be also heavily publicized in the future to have these sort of segregated Internet of Things networks that don't have to be either managed over the Internet or can be segregated in highly secured areas. The technologies that are used, as I mentioned before, I've got in there a router. The wired side, we're looking at a lot of legacy things. We're looking at serial technology, cables, the old school cables that you saw. Again, this type of technology can integrate with existing ones. So hooking an old printer up to an Internet of Things, technology is not out of the question if you needed it to be done. Or, as I mentioned before, very expensive equipment. The old methods, the old technologies they use can be integrated into this sort of newer Internet of Things. Power, obviously, we might have wired power. A lot of them rely on battery, which I'll talk about a little bit later. You've got, USB. So many of our devices now, keyboards, mice, headsets, printers, what have you, rely on USB. It's kind of the commonly used cable for computers and for phones. So obviously, wanting to integrate that into these controllers. I list on there like a touch screen. We're looking at the methods of input that these devices might have. A lot of them are very small. a lot of them rely on power heavily, or I should say limited power. So their methods of input might be only through this wireless or wired technology. Some of them might have touch screens. We're also looking at our normal either home hubs or network infrastructures that already exist. So we'll talk about the breakdown of the controllers a little later, but a lot of these still rely on connecting to what we would call Ethernet or our internal networks, and then going outbound from there or being centrally managed from there. So we're still looking at some wires connecting through if they're needed. But on this slide, we're talking a lot about the new wireless technologies that are being used. And obviously, this is optimal. You've got these devices. They're all over your home. In the near future, we might be looking at dozens or hundreds of these devices in your home, depending on how inexpensive and small they are and what's needed. So we don't want these wires running because the installation of that is very expensive, and the you have to again have wires. So obviously we're a wireless world now. I mentioned on here there's several wireless technologies. Some of them you're probably more familiar with, like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. The ones that the Internet of Things devices are really moving towards, for the most part, are two technologies, Zigbee and Z-Wave. And they're both very similar. The idea behind these technologies is that you don't need to, say, get a live video stream most of the time. That's a lot of data that needs to go back to, either your phone or a centrally managed server. You're looking for small signals, turn off, turn on. What's the temperature? You have these beacons sent out, like you think of old sonar and submarines. You have a beacon, a ping that gets sent out. You wait a few seconds, that ping returns back, and it lets you know sort of the environment you're in. So these small devices that are running on battery, they can't run Wi-Fi all day. For anyone who's used their phone with Wi-Fi enabled and you've watched stream videos, how long does your phone last? It's not going to last very long. If it lasts a day, then you've got a pretty good battery on there. And these devices a lot of these Internet of Things devices have been stated to try to last 5 years, which sounds like a long time. But some of them can do it. They can perform their tasks if they're sort of, say, for example, a motion sensor that's, in the corner that is part of your alarm system at home or in the office. That could potentially run for several years on a battery because of how the technology for the sensing works, but also the amount of data that's required to be sent out is just, every second, every 10 seconds. Or every time that it senses something, it'll send that data back. It doesn't need a constant stream. So it's able to turn off the radio and not transmit a lot, which consumes a majority of its power. So these technologies are the two that, are predominant there. I would say neither of them has dominated the market as of yet. One of them may in the future. But we'll talk about sort of security concerns with these general and with wireless in a little while. So the things, what are the things? The devices are the things that we normally think of. This is the things, the Internet of Things. We've got all of these devices all around that are now being converted or having new models that come out that can be interconnected with one another and remotely controlled. We also have other devices, servers, however you want to refer to them, that are necessary for the control of these local devices. We have a local controller most likely, and there'll be some diagrams of this in a moment. And this is necessarily what would send the commands and receive data back from all the things that are all over your home. We've got the command server, and that's different. This is normally the rest of these, the next 4 bullet points, generally reside on the actual Internet. You will send a command through your phone. You want to turn a light on. I'll just keep giving that example because that's a simple one. The phone connects to a web server somewhere. That web server then sends the command to the controller, which resides, we'll say, in your home, and then that controller relays that to the light bulb that says turn on, turn off, dim, what have you. So that's the command portion. You have a web application that's involved. Either that's through your mobile device, your smartphone, your tablet, which often have custom web applications or local applications running through your web browser. It might be something as simple as sending a text message. There certainly could be a text message base. It's something that I haven't really touched on too much is this is sort of still new. This technology is a bit in its infancy, enough so that the market can heavily drive, where things go. So we say the Internet of Things is much more a concept than it is a specific technology. It's the melding of technologies, and there's still a lot to be formed in this sort of realm. So a lot of we talk about maybe narrowed down in scope in the coming years, but for now, there's many options and many markets out there. So again, we're still sort of seeing how things go with that. Onto the update server. If you're used to seeing, if you're running Microsoft products or Apple products, you see constant updates. We're used to our software updating regularly. We supply patches. Well, these Internet of Things devices can also have patches supplied through firmware or through reconfiguration. So the small devices that are surrounding your home can also have these updates presented to them, software updates, not just configuration updates. So you might have a server that's dedicated specifically to these forms of updates. And then you've got the control server that might have logging enabled. It might have known the last time you turn your lights are on or off, or what the current status is before it has to make that request to the device. And again, we'll see some diagrams of this a little later on. So these can either be, some of these can be on the internet. If you want to centrally manage it, they could be in a building, an office, in a local area network. And then, of course, you have the user, or most likely users, with different permissions, different levels of access, and then also, how they're going to be controlling it, from their phone or from the device. And again, as Brad mentioned, I know, I'm sorry, I'm getting a feedback on someone. As Brad mentioned before, we're going to have a Q&A at the end of this. I'm normally used to having more of back and forth, but please, if you have any questions about any of these, this is obviously a very broad scope overview of the Internet of Things. We're not focusing on any specific devices and models or anything like that. So please, if you have any questions about your environment or future questions about where you see things, or I see things going, please do write those down and get those to me. Brad will help me out at the end. So what are the things? Talking about a light bulb, I have one listed on there. So, a good example that I like to think of is your keys to your car, right? You have the wireless connection to the keys to your car. We've been used to that for a very long time. The idea of these wireless devices all being around the home, it might still be a bit of a new concept, but if you think of, 30 years ago, not having a wireless key fob, you just think of keys, and then you had the transition to the wireless key fob. Now it's commonplace. We don't think of that as an advanced technology. We just walk up to our car, we click a button, or nowadays some of them have the proximity sensors, and you get in. Very, very similar ideas to the Internet of Things. In fact, I put this on there because you could have that same level of access to your house. You could have a clicker that unlocks your house, or the senses your proximity to the door or the home itself, or to your dog collar could open up the doggy door, and that could all essentially be managed to say, oh, the door is open, or do we want to allow so and so in, or you can unlock the door for the dog to let them in because you just got a text the dog is waiting to come in. So all these things might seem silly and trivial, but they do sort of make things very convenient. So I have on there a car, and when you think of this as how are you going to integrate a car, but really think of a service like OnStar. Not to say that they're particularly Internet of Things reseller, but the idea is that's integrated into your car, and this is from say years ago, not that long ago, whereas potentially they have control over it. They can monitor the GPS. Depending on the service level, you might be able to disable the car due to theft. They have a live voice stream where you can potentially call them. So integrating that into the Internet of Things, maybe your phone gets a text that says, hey, you need to get gas, remember to get gas, or I'm a car, my car needs to be serviced. Obviously, our cars are heavily automated now. The computer network inside the cars is very advanced with sensors. So if all that information could be pushed to your dealer or whoever you have monitoring the car, or GPS status, things like that, integrating the car is obviously a prime example of that. You've got, I put on there a heart monitor. You've got a lot of medical equipment, especially in hospitals. We think our lives are fast-paced, but in a medical situation, you really need things, as soon as possible. So having a heart monitor or some other medical equipment that automatically responds and sends information to the nurse or the doctor, whoever might be monitoring from another room. The medical field is obviously very concerned with security, but also heavily interested in this sort of fast-paced, fast information-moving technology that can be integrated into their lives. You've got a point-of-sale system. This might make it easier to centrally manage them, to have a checkout counter wouldn't necessarily have to be this kiosk anymore. You've got, these wireless methods to connect. You've got power, door locks, and not just to our home doors, but, office locations, we're used to having a key fob, but all of that can be wirelessly integrated and managed centrally, so you don't have all these different controllers or mechanisms that are in there. Another portion of the Internet of Things is this centrally managed, independent of brands. And I didn't really mention that before, but I should mention that now. A lot of these, like I mentioned, Zigbee and Z-Wave, these are standards that a lot of the corporations follow, and that's good because we want to be able to not depend on one single brand for everything, but to integrate different brand technologies together to simply manage them or manage them however we would like. So a lot of these are focusing on sort of these common technologies to be used, just like we do for the Internet. It doesn't matter if you're running a Windows or a Linux or a OS X or of Apple products. We all use the Internet the same because of standards. And so a lot of these technologies are integrating with each other using these similar standards. The one up here you might see that stands out the most is the toaster oven. Obviously, most of us don't have automated toaster ovens, or the automation is you press a button. But, what if you're on the back porch and you want to know when your toast is done? It sends you, a message on there, or you want to make sure that the toaster is, turned off, or, your stove is turned off. These are things that the Internet of Things can kind of bring together. So devices you wouldn't normally think of as being on the Internet are. Even, look at 10 years ago, we didn't, thinking your computer or your TV was going to be having some sort of embedded operating system that allows you to get online with that, seemed futuristic, and now it's commonplace. So a lot of these things will seem very commonplace in the very near future. How do they all come together? So we're looking at a one-to-many control. And what that means is you have your one device, your phone, and you can control many other things, all the other devices that are sitting at home with you. And there are three basic methods of control here. We have direct control, central control, and cloud control. So in direct control, you've got your phone, and you're connecting directly to, and in this instance, I just have several cameras listed, available at the home for security. And maybe these are sitting there waiting for your phone to connect. Your phone connects to one of them at a time, or a few of them to monitor them centrally. But you're directly connecting your handheld device, your laptop, your computer, to these, similar to how you would connect a mouse to your laptop. Those are one-to-one pairing, but the laptop can control a mouse, a keyboard, a printer, a bunch of things over USB. Then we introduce maybe a centralized controller that's dedicated to these devices. So maybe it handles all the different brands. Maybe they speak slightly different languages, the protocols are slightly different. Your phone might not be able to do that, or your phone only has Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and cellular connection. It doesn't have this Z-Way or Zigbee. So you need something to be an intermediary for these commands to get sent out. So you have this centralized controller this controller would be placed, physically in the area. It's going to talk wirelessly or wired to all the local devices scattered throughout. Our third option, and a way that most of these things have been going, especially for personal use, is to have it all go out to, the cloud or the internet. You've got your device that you're controlling. It connects, through cellular, through the Wi-Fi, through a web application, some sort of remote server. It says, hey, I'd like to, make sure my crock pot is turned off. I left it on accidentally. So it sends that signal to the web application. That web application has a back-end control server it interacts with. Says, okay, you need to, push out, talk to this other server that sends out the update, says, hey, make sure the crock pot is off. That gets logged in a database. The entire idea behind the cloud is that it's not all one server. So all 4 of these areas and potentially others could be either managed by a third party or, another company might manage the database and the logging. The database, might have your user information, and then a different database would have information about your devices. But in this instance, it all goes to the internet, and then a connection is made from this local controller back out to the internet, and then that connection gets sent out to all the local devices. So it sounds like a lot of hops to go through, but in the end user, they don't really need to know the difference between any of these 3. They all pretty much look the same to the end user. They, in this case, say, turn the camera on, and then either way, in any of these 3 scenarios, the camera turns on or off. It's all in the back end, the configuration. And in general, as we know in the security community, the more complex it becomes, the more potential there is for security risks. We can vet, this component and this component, but if this other component has issues, that can be the point of breach. That can be, where a major security should focus, or we need to, vet that heavily and make modifications. So on each layer that gets added here, we need to vet or look at all the technologies involved. So this image here gives you sort of the general broad scope and the current most popular method of Internet of Things technologies being sold to the consumer market. So now I'm going to go into some of the, Brad mentioned before, the 5 areas of security. And these aren't defined. I'm not setting this as a rule. These are the definite 5 areas of Internet of Things security. I'm just kind of bunching these together. As I mentioned, there's a lot of technologies involved here. Unlike what we're used to assessing sort of a specific small scope, there's so many things involved in Internet of Things that there's a very, very broad scope. But a lot of it focuses on existing methods that we test and the testing that's already been done. So the key is to bring all of those together when you have to assess, if you want to add this sort of technology, the Internet of Things, and bring it into your environment. So we look at the user side. A very common thing is fuzzing the input. And Brad, who made the preliminary introductions, has done quite a bit with this. We and our team have done a lot. So we're looking at, if you're not familiar with the phrase of fuzzing, it basically, most of these devices, most things, follow set protocols. And what we're looking to do is put false information in there. So it's invalid or unintended data. A very, very simple example might be if you've, say the field is expecting a name that's 20 characters long, and you put in 30 characters. What happens? Well, I don't know what happens. That's up to the developer. If they had vetted the input and know that it should only be this certain number of letters. If I put in a pound sign or hashtag sign instead of my name, what happens? Well, I don't know. These are the sort of, this is sort of data that we would put in to a field. If it's a username field, if you want to upload a file. So what if the small device can only has 12 megabytes of space, and I upload a 13 megabyte file? What happens? This is bad data. This is, in our sense, intentionally malicious data. And I need to see what happens to the device or the, the system as a whole if I input this bad data. It may cause, some serious issues. If you've heard of a buffer overflow, this is how buffer overflows are discovered and repeated. It may just cause the system to crash and may overwrite data. So this is a big one to focus on from the user side. False information. If you require, for security reasons, that the address be correct, how do you verify that? If you're the third party that's responsible, if you need to send the fire department to the correct address and the user mistyped it, how do you verify that? That can be a major security issue. Or if you're calling, you need to verify their name and then type their name and it's wrong in the third party system because the user accidentally supplied the wrong information. How do you account for that? Default settings. This is across the board. Anybody who does security will tell you probably the #1 way we would refer to as the low-hanging fruit that we get in are default settings. Are the default settings of this, I'm going to just refer to it as your Internet of Things, the one that's in place in your home or in your environment. Are the default settings of your Internet of Things, are they defaulted to the highest setting? Or, as we commonly find, are they defaulted to maybe some medium level settings? Because, as we all know, security is frustrating. As the user, we don't like security. Security makes us put in, 14-character passwords when we really wanted to put in 8-character ones. That makes our lives easier. So for usability, is the security set really low? Are there default settings? Are there default, passwords that are allowed? Are there other defaults that are allowed by the system that are set there, like default services? So a lot of things we need to focus on are, the user needs to be able to change or are forced to change some of these default insecure settings. Or, in certain instance, they're taking on the risk. If they opt out of the more secure settings, then you must inform them of that and also make sure that if anything happens, it's only their system that gets compromised because they chose insecure settings. It doesn't affect any other, clients or any other Internet of Things implementations that are out there. Say if they're centrally managed, you don't want one compromise of one user, to get back to the central server and infect other users. And the mobile application, we're obviously heavily invested in the security of mobile phone applications. Can other malicious applications, harvest passwords? Can they issue commands that could potentially unlock doors? So is the security of the host, the mobile application, and the application itself is paramount. If there's one malicious application on either the laptop or the desktop or, the phone, could that potentially cause, very real and serious threats to our Internet of Things setup? On to the hardware side, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of components here. Could hardware be modified? Could potentially, let's look at knockoff versions of the hardware. The cases look the same, but the inside is completely different. We're obviously very familiar with the idea of knockoffs, but what about with hardware? Could a malicious device be inserted into, or could the device be modified, the actual device, the one that you're thinking you're purchasing or are purchasing, be modified in a way to make it malicious at a hardware level? Could something be appended to it that has, a timer, and at this time it, disables all the cameras, that sort of thing? So we need to make sure, either all the devices are opened up and you look at the circuitry, which is obviously very cumbersome, or purchasing them from a trusted third-party vendor or from the actual manufacturer is paramount here. Just like you would buy, most of the corporations buy their laptops or, hardware from a very trusted third party that they've been working with for many years or directly from the manufacturer. You want to make sure that at a corporate level, this is a little bit less of a risk, but especially at a home level, if you're, looking for a refurbished version from eBay, you need to make sure if that's being incorporated in your home security that it's trusted and nothing has been done, which also leads into modifying firmware. There are several layers, different kinds of firmware. A lot of the very small devices are running, firmware that's designed for their chips, and I won't go into that very much. Others are running embedded operating systems, and that might come as a surprise to some people. A lot of them run an embedded version of Linux, which offers a lot of the same abilities as a normal version of Linux. They strip out things like a graphical user interface, and a lot of the core environment still remains. So if it's Linux, then it's at least at some level based on open source software. So if this software, if this platform, has other open source versions of firmware, could we potentially push our own firmware? If I have local access to the device, could I'll talk about this in a second, push my own malicious firmware to either the controller or other devices in the area? This firmware could give me, a backdoor. It could automatically perform a task for me. It could be malicious, again, in a resale sort of setting where I, buy a bunch of these devices, I modify them, I put them on Craigslist or eBay or even Amazon or some other reseller. I get them out there, and then I have, local control, because as soon as they connect those devices up, it will perform its malicious activity and give me, remote access. So firmware modification is heavy, is of high importance and potential. Serial control, this is a much lower level. We think of serial cables, a lot of people from way back in the day, but a lot of devices still use serial internally or to connect to one another. And serial control can often give very low level access, could potentially be displaying information for debug. A lot of times the manufacturers, or if your device is somehow malfunctioning, you ship it back, they go into the serial console, and that's how they can interact with it in a very low level. If these aren't properly secured, it might allow an attacker to do the same thing. Again, they're looking at potentially modifying it, harvesting information. If these devices are all shipped with the same keys, at the same settings, the same nuggets that we can use to potentially attack other devices of the same model, these might be potential access through serial. Another thing is the disk. So we don't think of normally these type of devices having disks, but what if it has a disk level, like a flash drive level, and we can access that and read information off of it. Monitoring traffic, if we have local network access, we can obviously monitor the traffic, sniff it like we would normally do. We could potentially spoof resources, which I just mentioned, potentially pretending that, putting a malicious, say you're on the corporate network, setting up something that says it's the update server for these Internet of Things devices and pushing a malicious firmware or command. Monitoring the network traffic. If it's unencrypted and I can see the local traffic, can I extract information, username, passwords, what settings are being sent across, things like that. Service control, so not only am I pushing malicious firmware, I might be able to impersonate the server, so I could bypass the user level. I don't have to compromise the phone. If I'm on the network already, maybe I can attempt to issue commands directly to that local controller to unlock a door, disable an alarm system, what have you. The internet-based, I'm going to list all of them sort of at once because they all have the same levels of security. I should have put cloud as first because that's our typical thinking now. It goes off to this remote server that manages everything. So we have our web application. So a lot of times people are looking at the Internet of Things as the devices that sit locally, my local controller, my phone, but really there's a high security risk of, if I'm an attacker, I probably don't really care about an individual user. If, we hear the phrase advanced persistent threat, or somebody who's targeting your company, maybe they want to target you or your users. That's difficult, but if I want to gain a large level of access to, thousands of site locations or configurations of Internet of Things, I target these first 5. If I can compromise any of those, I might potentially be able to gain direct access to these particular locations. If I get the database, I can learn the location, who registered it, So making sure that all of these levels are highly secured, redundancies, things like that, following obviously the best practices in segregation. If they're a third party, who the third parties are, do we trust them? Basic knowledge of their infrastructure security, because this is a level that we have little control of in the normal circumstance. This has gone off to the third party who's monitoring or allowing us to access this data. So we want to make sure that, that this is secured by talking with the company who's hosting and providing these services. And then we have the technologies themselves. Wireless, the hardware, imaging power, and the protocols. Not all of these are designed with security in mind, or there's a low security option. I mentioned before with the default settings, obviously, a lot of things have lower security. Like, for example, one of them I've been working with is Zigbee, that wireless technology I mentioned before. It has several security modes. The high security one, all the data is wirelessly encrypted. The medium security one, some of the data, and the low security one, none of it. The reason things like that exist is, if you're not familiar with encryption, it essentially it uses a lot more of the processor, which translates to using more power. So these devices that want to run for 5 years on a battery, when you add encryption, that might reduce that time by half to 1 year. It can significantly reduce that time that they're allowed to run on a single battery. So the encryption overhead is that you have to replace the battery more often, which if it's a high secure environment, you might not mind, but that might be why it's not necessarily that the developers of these technologies didn't know what they were doing and didn't know about the security. They had to allow for these various levels depending on the environment. And you find that in almost all technologies. You have varying levels of security. Making sure that depending on the environment and the security level you need, that you have everything set to the highest level, either during the default installation if you're a manufacturer trying to set these as the standard. If you have these in your environment, assessing each portion of the technology, does it rely on power? By power, I mean, does it rely on being plugged in? If there is a sudden loss of power, is there a battery backup? If it's a security system, as many of these devices incorporate with, is there a backup generator? Is there a battery that can temporarily work? The hardware, if you're looking at the board themselves and you can physically access the device, what are you able to do with that? Can you do the things I mentioned before about modifying firmware, adding new devices? The protocols, a simple one is, when we go to a website, we log into our bank, we want it to set that little security lock in the corner or say HTTPS. That's to simplify it, the secure version of our standard HTTP. That's a protocol that can be heavily used here. We're also looking at maybe proprietary ones, but are they sending traffic from your network to the internet or from the internet to your phone over a secure channel? Could somebody at Starbucks or coffee shop potentially sit there and monitor the open wireless and see the data that's being sent across? So making sure that understanding the technologies themselves individually and not looking at them as just a whole product and assessing them is really key to making sure that they're at their most secure level. So just a brief recap of kind of what we talked about as far as the Internet of Things. I know there's a lot here, a lot to go over. Some of it you've probably heard before, but it is still sort of a new concept of having all these things centrally managed and available at our fingertips. And so weighing that out with the current methods is key. Remote command and control is obviously a big area of concern. Can they watch all your camera feeds that you have? Can you unlock doors or disable security, alarms? These are, more of a high level things. Obviously, somebody could do more malicious things. I mean, if you think about, I mentioned before the oven. If you're able to remotely do that, you could obviously prove more malicious intent. But for our purposes, looking at our corporate security levels, what can they do if they compromise, the different layers? So having a whole scope of from the camera all the way to your phone, everywhere in between, what needs to be the security in place. Can we clone a device? Can we pretend to be a device that's either on the network or one that's being controlled? to get certain data out, especially over these wireless technologies. And could I somehow join my device with false information to the controller and then sort of interact with the local network, monitoring the traffic of what's going on, pivoting onto the network. If one of these devices is compromised, maybe all it controls are the lights, which isn't a big deal potentially, or we would notice that sort of a thing. But if this controller or these devices are on a secured, corporate network, could that device be compromised and then leveraged to pivot into the internal network, and then, as we say, like get a foothold into the internal network? We're coming up on close to time. I want to make sure that we have time for a few questions in the end. So I'm just going to show this really quick, just to give you some of the complexity. A lot of times when we go on, an assessment, we are often, it's a specific kind of assessment here, an internal. We're looking at an internal network. We're looking at cloud. We're looking at, just the embedded device. But if you want to give a real view of every aspect of, incorporating the Internet of Things, you have to look at all of these. You have to look at physical access. If the device is outside of your physical security parameter, meaning it's a sensor out on the gate, or it's a camera, if that one device gets compromised, could that lead to compromise of all the other devices? Your mobile applications, network services. So you kind of, you need to make sure that all of this is reviewed before incorporating it, or reviewed if you already have it, the Internet of Things devices in place. A few questions to ask if you're going to be implementing this sort of thing. What are the inherent risks of the technology? And I've covered a lot of those. This is only an hour, and again, there are many things involved there. So there are, make sure to break it down item by item. What are the security risks? What are the realms, as I just showed back here? What level of security is allowed? This might be a user layer. Which users are allowed to access what sort of services? Is it flat? Are all users allowed to access the same thing? In particular, what's being stored and sent through these third parties? Are they vetted? Will they let you know sort of the security that they have in place to make sure that your data is secured? Are they using themselves, other parties, to store the data? And is there a best practice? Talking about the technologies, has the company that's providing these Internet of Things devices provided you as a user with a best practice sheet that says this is the highest security level that we can offer, and does that meet the standards that you require? I'm going to go ahead. This is we talked about the Internet of Things, bringing all of our devices together, many of which we wouldn't have normally had on the Internet or on a network before. What the things are, how to vet them, and asking the right questions. And again, these are just a few. Those are just a few questions. Obviously, looking at the whole scope, you want to have more. And with that said, we have a few minutes. Brad's going to handle some questions, but I appreciate everybody for being here, and we'll have a few questions now from the audience.
Thank you, everyone. And just as a reminder, if you have a question, please use the chat functionality and send it to Brad Antonowitz. JP, we do have one question coming in privately from the chat. The question was, would you say the general public consumers are more at risk when utilizing Internet of Things? Is it too early to tell? Would you use IP-enabled locks in your house?
Oh, targeted question, huh? Well, I think so. This is targeting, the end user. It's hard to say. As I mentioned before, we haven't seen too many large-scale incidents of this, and I believe that the technology, can be used very well and securely to an extent. But we live in a day and age where compromises are, let's say, not frequent, but somewhat frequent. And if you look at losing your credit card information, that's one thing that they mail you your credit card. If you look at sort of the central management of your home, obviously that needs to be put on a much higher, say, pedestal than credit card information, even Social Security number, because you're looking at the potential for physical access, physical, I won't say bodily harm, but physical access to a building or monitoring. So it depends. And this, I hesitate to give my personal opinion, so I'll stick off of that because that's just me. I don't want to sort of represent anything with the, the webinar. But I think that it can be done well. I think it's very early in the stages of the Internet of Things. So promoting things like this and best security practices is key, and maybe even having standards for storage for these sort of devices.
Great, thank you, JP. We have another one coming in. It's with manufacturers blending Zigbee and Z-Wave connectivity to appliances. Is there potential for unprotected devices to be listed without the owner knowing, such as security systems with default passwords being showed up on sites like Shodan?
So with Shodan, how it works, just to clarify here, it looks on the internet for specific web pages, web services, things like that for defaults, and then you can search the website for that. If you look up IP cameras, or the classic example, ones that are connected directly to the internet, which predate this technology, looking for those existing. How most of the Internet of Things works is that there's either a direct management or centrally managed. The likelihood of them being, each device being connected directly to the internet is low. The likelihood of the controller being connected to the internet is possible. And in that way, it might be possible to directly connect to that device in that way over the internet. Locally, there are some issues with the wireless technologies and how they can potentially pair with one another. There's a setup process to add a new device, and during that process, if a malicious attacker could potentially have their device join, and then there's a lot of, I say potential, there's a lot of potential here because these are individual, there's not necessarily standards of how they would react to the network, but there is potential to add malicious devices during that joining phase, or if there's some sort of denial of service, pick off the device and force a new joining of these devices. There is potential to have a malicious one joined and interact on the network.
Excellent. Thank you, JP. We have one next question coming in. So given the scenario that it would take years until manufacturers to get the level of base security going in the right direction, do you see the possibility of assuring even home users that they are safe? For instance, through encapsulating traffic. What would be the best idea for companies? What should someone that evaluates something connected to the Internet of Things take heed of?
Okay, I'm going through all that in my mind. So I think, there are two, let's break it down into two basic components, and I've been talking about them some. You have the trusted third parties. Your data is being sent out to the internet, we'll use the term the cloud, and it's being managed there. Then you have your local one. So as far as, home users are concerned, I obviously work in security, so I want as much control of it as I can. However, the general populace is not as knowledgeable about security, so the more control they have might not be the best. So in my personal opinion, I like forcing users into a secure realm, even though they might not necessarily like that. Again, long passwords, that sort of thing. But as far as the local area one goes, I personally feel that's the best way to securely manage all of your data and to have as much of it stored locally as possible. But that's not the way that, we've kind of developed as a society. We're very used to having the data, centrally managed somewhere else out in the cloud. And that's a give and take. If it's done well, it can be done right and highly secured environments and hashing and that sort of thing, then third parties can do it. My concern right now is that sort of the infancy of this technology. A lot of the things being thrown into it, a lot of devices are put out by startups, which is great for the technologies themselves. But as far as the security level of a lot of startup companies, that might be very, very low on their list. So in this infancy stage, they're set up, and obviously, one manufacturer, their devices connect to this sort of local Internet of Things. The compromise of that one device could affect all the local ones. As far as making the general public aware, it's sort of the same as a lot of other security realms. You know, I think a lot of it's going to have to do with standards and sort of a public, you know, need for this security to actually be vetted in some sort of way, and to make sure that there's no possibility, you know, many redundancies in the security, to make sure that nobody can open, you know, your home front door either locally or over the internet.
Great, thank you, JP. We have a couple of more questions, but we'll follow up with them via email. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us at sales@foundstone.com or @Foundstone on Twitter. Thanks everybody for your time. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we'll be offering a recording later on in the week. Have a great day.